G'day guys, this one is on the thyroid and endotoxin, so lipopolysaccharides and how they affect the actual thyroid. So most people probably know that, well, you know, your thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, is the thing that most people talk about. They talk about in terms of the nutrients that you basically need. So there's a lot of talk about that we need things like iodine, selenium, things like zinc, and a number of other micronutrients and all that to help the thyroid function properly, do all its conversions of all those hormones and all that. The thing that we need to understand is that the thyroid is dependent on a sort of hypothalamus pituitary, thyroid axis, if you could call it that way. So they sort of work together. So I mean, within the hypothalamus, you've got a thing called TRH, which is thyroid. Let me just pronounce this right. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. And so basically there is a messenger RNA, so RNA transcription of that within the hypothalamus. And what that does is that will stimulate the actual pituitary gland to actually produce TSH, but also, as a side issue, also have a stimulating effect on prolactin. But that's for another day, when we'll talk about prolactin and its implications to thyroid function, alopecia, and many other things. But we'll just keep it to this sort of axis. And so this video will basically focus on how endotoxin affects this whole mechanism, because basically thyroid health is really an autoimmune system disease. It's basically a condition that I believe is really driven by endotoxin and driven by leaky gut. So obviously the leaky gut condition has to do with eating a species inappropriate diet. Some people are more susceptible to intestinal dysbiosis and leaky gut than others. Some people are able to better cope with gluten, better able to cope with a number of compounds that assault the gut lining, and others are less capable. Now, there are a whole lot of reasons for that. There's also basically, people not getting sufficient fat-soluble vitamins that play a key role in those mucosal layer barriers and all that. Certain inappropriate foods that people eat, where if you don't get enough fats, because both monounsaturated fats and saturated fats do help increase DAO and a number of other things. So it's a myriad of things that compromise the gut. In particular, it's the foods. I mean, most people, if they're eating a species appropriate diet, they will have eliminated the compounds that can actually do the assault. And so it is far less of an issue. But when you actually increase the assault and you actually cause gut permeability, what we call leaky gut, you will basically release more LPS. Now, LPS, this endotoxin can actually behave very differently in different tissue. And depending on some of the other micronutrients in your diet, some of the genetic susceptibilities, it can vary. Some people can end up with, issues of autoimmunity in the thyroid, others autoimmunity in joints, other all sorts of different autoimmunities that can actually happen. And they vary. And so it's really hard. But in this case, we're going to be focusing on the thyroid in particular and looking at how LPS affects directly this sort of hypothalamic, pituitary, and thyroid sort of axis, and how it causes a number of dysfunctions, which then increase they create this sort of autoimmune effect within the body, because remember, LPS is actually overstimulating, as we saw in the previous video, overstimulating some of those, brain type macrophages, those glial cells. And that's the thing that we need to take into consideration. And so there will be a number of ways this will have an effect on different people, as I said. So in this case, we're focusing on the thyroid. So LPS, does affect these cells. It doesn't really have when it comes to basically the levels, when we're looking at the levels of when we're looking at T4 levels, they seem, seem to go down. The conversion of T3 doesn't seem to decrease. So when you initially look at the sort of condition, you don't make the connection. It's only when the condition sort of progresses that it becomes quite clear that all these downstream pathways are starting to not work properly. So, I mean, if you get enough selenium, zinc, and stuff like that, you will do the conversion, but you won't create enough, TSH to basically provide sufficient. And so, but that's because these other pathways in the brain are actually being affected by endotoxin. And so, I mean, there's a number of conditions that are basically of these autoimmune, there's Graves' disease, Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, which most people know about. And there is also can be imbalances in this hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. So you may not have full-blown Hashimoto's, but you may have sort of some dysfunction in terms of some thyroid condition dysfunction that may be caused because of some of the dysregulating effects that endotoxin causes in these parts that actually are required to basically, create the hormones that then, can be converted to what the body needs, the active forms, to be able to do what it needs. So I'll just start sharing this. Let me just share this study. It's an old study. It goes back, it's, 1997. I know it's a bit poor quality. Let me just increase it slightly. I do apologize that it's not the best quality, but I can't really do much about it. This is the copy that I got. It's a photocopy of the original. So it's not the best, unfortunately. So we'll just have to go with what we've got. So inhibition of hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis in response to lipopolysaccharides is independent of changes in circulating corticosteroids. So there's been talk in the past that corticosteroids and all that may have an effect on that, but here we can show independently that even though these corticosteroids can actually change, they don't affect the negative effects. They don't have any corrective way of actually affecting or down or altering the negative effects of endotoxin, of LPS. So that's really important. I'll just show further down. So we'll just read the abstract for a sec. We have investigated the role of circulating glucocorticoid steroids in the suppression of hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis following lipopolysaccharides injection in rats. Intraperitoneal peritoneal injection of LPS, 2.5 kilogram. That's per kilogram. So how much would that be? So basically, you're talking about let me get it right because I'm going to fucking fuck it. Otherwise, 30 grams. Kilogram, that's right, 0.03. Yeah, what was the previous one? I just could not remember it. So it is 0.03. Okay, times 2.5. So we're looking at basically 0.075 grams, 3 grams, micrograms. So 75 micrograms, okay? So basically they've injected 75 micrograms of LPS, suppressed periventricular nucleus, which is the neurons in the hypothalamus, and thyroid releasing hormone, which is the TRH. So RNA transcription, which is basically just the body's way to actually transcript these hormones. So everything uses RNA transcription to produce hormones, proteins, enzymes, blah blah blah, and pituitary thyroid stimulating hormone and the plasma thyronine. In these animals, LPS also increased periventricular nucleus corticotropic releasing hormones. So it had an effect in releasing those, but that didn't actually improve the pituitaries or the hypothalamic releases of those other hormones, which are important. So it's just a response, to that sort of inflammation, but it's not basically, while the body may respond in a certain way, it's not going to repair this mechanism until it eliminates the LPS. So, and POMC as well, and plasma corticosterone levels. To investigate the role of plasma corticosterone in the suppression of the HPT axis, we clamp the plasma corticosterone levels at morning baseline level by bilateral. So they basically just prevented those coming through. 10 days after surgery, LPS injected evoked dramatic increase in CRH and POMC. So they got the response they want. Despite the lack of change in plasma corticosterone in those that were clamped, LPS was still able to suppress TRH and TSH levels in both clamped and shammed. That means both the ones that were clamped and both the ones that weren't. So that's quite clear that LPS has a direct effect on this axis that affects the thyroid hormones. These data indicate that in response to LPS, suppression of the HPT axis occurs and is independent of LPS-induced increases in plasma corticosterone corticosterone. So even though LPS does increase these other factors, it doesn't basically have any effect on the deleterious effects of LPS on TRH out of the hypothalamus and TSH out of the pituitary. So it has no effect on those. So obviously the downstream from those two is the thyroid, which the thyroid is then not getting enough TSH to produce T4. So basically that's why we saw in the other one TS4 will drop off, but T3, the conversion is okay because you've got all the other micronutrients, your zinc, your selenium, your iodine and all that. They're all fine. But basically, if you don't have enough, the thyroid can't do the job of producing enough T4. So this is another reason why, doctors will supplement T4, but they won't fix the problem. The problem is LPS, endotoxin. So if you get rid of LPS with MK4 and you fix your gut lining by taking the species inappropriate foods out, we will correct this. Now let's just look the rest of the study. Okay, so here we can see LPS times of injection in. So LPS is this dark color, and the light one is the sham group. That means the one that wasn't affected. So as you can see, TRH drops, TSH drops quite a bit, and the plasma T3 actually goes up. Actually, it responds, to a bigger requirement of thyroid hormone active for, but that's in the short run. In the long run, if you run out of T4 because all the other ones are being suppressed and affected, well, that's not going to last for very long, that effect. So we can see that LPS doesn't have an effect on the conversion, but this is a downstream thing, and most physicians focus on the T4, T3, the downstream, and completely ignore the TRH and TSH and the endotoxin effects on that, the leaky gut. So we need to fix the leaky gut. And even here, we can see that substantial increases in responses. So the body's responding to the LPS, but it makes no difference because responding to something does not correct the secretion from these two areas, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So hypothalamic TRH drops, pituitary TSH drops as well. So the body may respond, but it's, LPS is doing its damage. And we can see this is the sham, this is the clamp. So basically, even if you the sort of effects still jump up under the influence of LPS. It's only in this case where the plasma of corticosterone is basically at cellular levels. A substantial depression of serum T3 concentrations in association with normal T4 and TSH concentrations is the most common thyroid response to SES. So in severe cases, suppression of TSH concentration is also observed, which eventually happens, which eventually will happen, you know. So, you know, initially you may not see these things. These are short term. Let's not forget these studies are short term. They're looking at a specific small time slot, you know. But if you have this sort of situation where and you've got leaky gut, and endotoxin is undermining, you know, your ability to actually produce these hormones, you know, over time, things will start not functioning properly. You'll start losing, of course, you know, start causing all sorts of the sort of side effects of, you know, an autoimmune disease. So the two critical vitamins here, obviously, in dealing with autoimmunity is definitely vitamin D, but also MK4 is an important element in that because it suppresses and deals with, you know, you've got these macrophage that need to be regulated. So they need both vitamin D and MK4. MK4 plays a big role when it comes to endotoxin, as I've demonstrated before, but vitamin D also plays a role, you know, so we can't neglect either one of these. So when you're dealing with leaky gut, and I believe that to a large extent, a lot of the autoimmune diseases are leaky gut. So a derangement in thyroid function can be for a number of other reasons. That's true, which is not autoimmune. Autoimmune, I believe, is really driven by this incorporation into tissue of LPS, and then it generates an antibody response against it. So what MK4 can do is basically deal with the endotoxin, and then the vitamin D can regulate the macrophage response as well. So the immune response, so it doesn't over exaggerate the immune response, and it's properly regulated, and it sort of tempers down the inflammation, because we don't want it. We want to correct the situation and temper down the inflammation so we do less damage. So those two do play a very synergistic role together. So if you're going to basically focus, obviously you've got to look at, you know, dealing with a leaky gut, and that is getting rid of the species inappropriate foods out of your diet. You know, you can take menaquinone 4, you can take vitamin D, but it's not going to help you in the long run if you keep on assaulting your gut barrier with species inappropriate foods, especially if you're susceptible. Some people are more susceptible than others, depending on their genetics, depending on their exposure to glutens and lectins and many other things like that over a number of generations. They may have a better ability to cope with those sort of things. So people from the Mediterranean, people from the Middle East, people from a lot of the Asian sort of countries have been exposed to some of these things for far longer. So they tend to have greater robustness when it comes genetically. But, you know, not everybody does. If you've got a European ancestry, or an ancestry of the Americas or African, or a number of, you know, the Polynesians, or, you know, Pacific Islanders and places like that, these populations have far less, you know, are more susceptible to these sort of, to LPS than other populations. So, but it varies. There are genetics that can vary, but also the type of foods that we eat and the level of assault. Obviously, the level of assault on the gut is going to vary between person. The higher the level of the assault, nowadays, the assault is on steroids. It's primarily because we've got emulsifiers. A lot of the processed foods have got a lot of emulsifiers, and what they do is they break down the gut mucosal layers. And so then expose the actual tight junctions to assault by lectins and gluten and many other things. So the thing is, the emulsifiers are accelerating. And if you take a look at every single processed food, it's full of emulsifiers. And that's what is the biggest driver of leaky gut, is emulsifiers and processed foods. So I have rarely, and this problem is not only in the SAD dieters. We need to basically realize that a lot of the keto treats out there, a lot of the low carb treats, and a lot of the other treats that a lot of people think, paleo treats and all that, do have emulsifiers. And those emulsifiers are actually contributing largely to this leaky gut problem. So if you continue consuming those things, you will expose yourself to more of these lipopolysaccharides. So you have to remember that basically what I said earlier, that basically these little hairline structures that exist at the tip, basically they get a phosphate group, which basically adds a negative charge to them. That negative charge allows them not to stick and to flow through, because it's hydrophobic. So this coating creates by phosphorylation, as it's called, which is adding this phosphate to them. It actually creates this negative charge, but also this hydrophobic effect, so they can sort of move through our gut. And it's really important that we understand this. And when these bacteria die, they release this endotoxin. When they shed, because these little hairline structures, very small hairline structures at the surface. You saw the image that I put on the previous one. You could see the little hairline structures. When you zoom in, they get shedded, like our hair gets shedded, the same sort of thing. And that sort of stuff, if you've got leaky gut, just goes into the bloodstream and will go past the blood-brain barrier and into your hypothalamus, into your pituitary gland, and they will have a negative effect, and they will drive a number of different autoimmune diseases, depending on also, to some extent, also your genetic susceptibility. But they can drive other issues like that, joint pain. A lot of older people that have got joint pain, again, it's due to a lot of this shit that's coming through because you've got a leaky gut. The things that create leaky gut are basically species inappropriate foods, in particular the processed foods, the highly refined foods, and one of the biggest culprits that I personally believe, that is my personal opinion, and there is good research to show that basically a lot of these emulsifiers are breaking down the mucosal layers in our guts and opening up the actual gut lining to attack from lectins and gluten. I don't think lectins and gluten were a big problem in the past. They've become a bigger problem now because of these emulsifiers. Or in the past, yes, there could have been mild levels of leaky gut and issues like that. We know that they did exist. But the reality is now with emulsifiers, it's actually accelerated this process, where it may have taken an assault of inappropriate foods a number of decades in the past before people in much older age, middle age or older started getting gut problems. Now we're seeing it in very young people. And the reason for that is because the emulsifiers are accelerating the damaging effects to the gut lining. That's the problem. They're breaking down these mucosal layers much faster than they can be restored and making the gut vulnerable to these endotoxins, glutens, lectins, stuff like that. And that's what's driving a lot of the autoimmune problems in younger and younger people. So we need to basically correct the gut. A lot of issues when it comes to autoimmunity, and a lot of issues that people suffer, bloating, fevers, skin conditions, you name it, acne, all these sort of things are due to large extent leaky gut and psoriasis and all that. So you need to fix the gut, guys, and you need to get rid of any of those foods that basically are potentially putting you at risk. So I hope this will help provide a sufficient information to understand what is driving this and how to correct it, how to basically reverse a lot of this problem. It's basically really fixing the leaky gut and actually suppressing the endotoxin and basically regulating properly the immune system with vitamin D. These are the things that are required. Retinol plays a role because it does play a synergistic role with them. Then it's these 3 fat-soluble vitamins that are very important. Species-appropriate diet provides them, but a species-appropriate diet can be undermined if people incorporate a number of inappropriate cheats that have these emulsifiers and other elements that can create additional problems and prevent the resolution that a species-appropriate diet would correct if these other elements weren't at play. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Look, you got to look after yourselves, guys, and you got to avoid the crap out there. There's too much, and we're consuming far too much. So anyway, see yous.